I will also extend my thanks to everyone, and certainly to Ken and Peter for the opportunity to participate here. My take, so very much in agreement on much with Gary had to say. Um, my focus or my lens here is primarily centered around the continent itself and governments and what governments can do to bridge the gap that Gary's talking about. So we can talk about soft skills and we can talk about solutions, but somewhere along the way there needs to be an active level of engagement to really close institutional gaps that really engage the private sector. And that is the private sector, not only locally, where some of those markets are still emerging and developing and evolving, but that is also the private sector that's able to bring capital from outside of the country. There were really some interesting examples in that regard. The other thing that I think is very important is we think about the type of sort of transition from government or sort of government or state sort of initiated projects to more public-private project. And I realize that that term is quite loaded, right? It's a very loaded term, public-private. I would say, that sustainability
Always
and
minded.
I would say that sustainability and the need for projects that are going to be able to provide a foundation for the kinds of things that Gary's talking about, solid jobs, solid employment, but in a way that also enhances and protects the resources of the continent become critical in the way that's done. And so, I think we're all aware, perhaps too much aware, of past exploitations of some of these great assets and some of these great resources. So the focus here of managing sort of control and disposition in a way that benefits the local population is, to me, what's critical. Now, one last thing, and I'll certainly defer, but this is a problem that needs to be solved within the continent on the terms that the continent and the leaders in the continent define. It's certainly not to be solved in Washington, and I'll leave you with whatever innuendo you would take from last night. But the point simply, though, is that this has the leadership or the lead or the direction for these kinds of initiatives, and I can be more concrete in a bit. They really do need to come from the continent. And so the work that you're doing around defining what these entities are and what these structures are and what these projects are and what these needs are really will be reinforced by the leadership initiatives that you guys are putting in place now. Now, I just want to pause with one last comment here. Much of my work in terms of academic research focuses on specifically this space, and in particular, it focuses on something that is somewhat a misnomer, at least in the contemporary sense. I spend a lot of time thinking about government investment funds, sovereign wealth funds. What's fascinating to me is the growth in sovereign wealth funds has been most stark, most aggressive, right? Highest, actually in the African continent. And what's interesting about these funds, where you say, where is the wealth? The wealth is in the ground, the wealth is in the people, the wealth is in the resources. And these funds actually are not designed so much to manage existing wealth, but actually to create wealth. So what I'd like to do is maybe share a little bit of that later, because there are some really, really good and interesting examples, both at the country level, but increasingly on some work I've been doing recently, also at the subnational level.
Patrick, how does that chime with the examples you were going to give us in terms of sovereign wealth and places to invest?
Well, no, I think the points are excellent. One thing I sort of ask, right, is how do we do this in scale? How do we do it to make significant impact? And in terms of gaps, there clearly are things that are missing. Looking back to the institutional discussion, but there are massive infrastructure gaps. So in order to create markets physically, right, you have to connect people. You have to connect them via air, by sea. You have to connect them by road. These kinds of projects also have they create obviously opportunities for employment in the near term. when you think about where we are with COVID, and Joan makes an excellent point about the internet accelerating and facilitating and closing gaps. The reality, certainly on the economic side, is that COVID is pushing everyone back. It's setting everyone back, and it's creating much higher debt to GDP levels. It's creating fiscal deficits on the continent. Where's this money going to come from? Because these requirements don't go away. What's the infrastructure gap on the continent today? Is it $3 to $4 trillion between now and those are very large numbers. It's close to 2 to 3 billion, perhaps even 2 to 300 billion, perhaps more than that annually. So how do those gaps get closed in order to facilitate development in scale, employment in scale? Now, from a US perspective, and Gary was talking about geostrategy, there is no coherent policy. The Chinese have certainly closed that gap in a lot of ways. They've closed it in ways that have not necessarily been to the benefit of the citizenry of the continent. That's not to say that we have to stand back and create a grand strategy for all of this, but the idea that we can focus our attention on specific sectors like infrastructure, like construction, in order to be able to build the foundation or the base, to me makes a great deal of sense. This is the opportunity from my standpoint to be able now to catalyze private sector capital into some of these countries in order to be able to facilitate and create these opportunities. By the way, this is not only about transportation infrastructure, it's also about energy infrastructure. And it's also about telecommunications infrastructure that facilitates the very things that Gary and Joan are talking about. Because even there, access, right, to connectivity, access to the world really can be improved. It can be enhanced.
Yeah. And I think that's, isn't that an opportunity? I think it's 600 million Africans are still living off the grid. So if you've not got access to power, you've not really got access to much in a ways of sort of developing your own industries, etc. Surely that is an opportunity for people to come in. I know there was President Obama's Power Africa project, which I don't know how successful that was. I guess it was just very, very long term and it got marred in politics possibly. But actually, it's still got to be a great opportunity if you've got a continent which is undergoing a demographic revolution and it needs power. That's got to attract people in, surely.
Well, I quite agree. there were really fascinating local level solutions that have been funded in order to basically create power opportunities that are linked, for example, to mobile communication and mobile payment services. These are happening in East Africa, they're happening in West Africa. They're generally funded on a relatively small scale, at least the ones that I've been familiar with. They've been funded on a small scale by certain corporations, but also by private sector, private equity or impact investors. So as the idea of impact capital, impact investing, impact venture, as it expands and grows, these small scale opportunities really sort of evolve. And from my standpoint, they create the prospect of again, catalyzing private capital directly into these kinds of arrangements. Again, and I'd like to come back to that at some point. I think we do have to return, to the issue of infrastructure. Of an institutional base. One thing I want to point out, and this is a bit troubling to me, that some of the very largest private investors, private equity investors, so not the impact investors on the small scale, but private equity investors on the large scale, infrastructure investors have actually exited Africa. So they've created initiatives to come to the continent. I'm thinking of Blackstone. It's a huge, very large private investor, equity investor, infrastructure investor globally, based in the US, but has exited Africa. So the team that was there, an excellent team that was there, Black Rhino in Dhaka, that team has transitioned out. And so these are folks that had extraordinary capacity and leadership. They were Americans of African heritage, and now they've exited the continent, at least for the moment, in order to pursue other arrangements because the firms themselves have exited. The question I ask is why? How do we arrest that? What kind of things can be done in order to bring that capital back and to mobilize it?
And just to Patrick and Gary, I mean, when you're hearing all this, does this open up new opportunities, new ideas for you on just how we get involved? As we said at the outset, the biggest issue facing Africa is the need for jobs and the need to give jobs and dignified jobs to the youth. Patrick, any thoughts on that?
Certainly, yes, yeah. First of all, I wanted to, Dee makes such an interesting point. She used the word propaganda, and that resonated with me. And Joan obviously is talking about sort of misunderstandings or unwarranted sort of concerns about things that are happening on the continent from an investment or business standpoint. So I wanted to echo this because that represents a fundamental barrier to the flow of capital. So when you think about moving capital from the US or from France or from wherever it's coming from into Africa, that flow is going to be based on concerns that people have or investors have about risks. And if they perceive those risks somehow to be elevated in some fashion or another, whether that's based on propaganda or misunderstanding or whatever it is, the capital's not going to flow, projects aren't going to be funded, the infrastructure gap is not going to close, and you sort of persist in this mire. So an initiative that I was intrigued by, that I learned about last year, was an initiative that the USAID, the Agency for International Development, put in place a couple of years ago, and basically partnered to create an initiative that's called Mobilizing Institutional Infrastructure to develop, mobilizing institutional investment to develop African infrastructure. So what is this, right? It's a partnership of sorts. The idea is simply this, that you have a lot of capital that is tied up in US pension funds, in US dollars, that is seeking investment in infrastructure in emerging markets. But the barrier is that, and this is the way AID presented this, is that there's an entire misunderstanding, an over accentuation of the risks associated with investing in Africa, specifically in infrastructure. And so what they sought to do was to, in effect, create a bridge. Now, I can't speak to how successful this has been to date, but to create a bridge that links opportunities for investment in Africa in infrastructure, perhaps also including local pension funds with local currencies, to investors, again, institutional investors, stable capital, patient capital, long-term capital, the kind of capital you need to invest in infrastructure into the continent. Now, I will defer to Gary, but what would be interesting is to talk about the initiatives on the other side in Africa that are also they're building that bridge in the other direction. And I think it'd be interesting to talk about some of those. But for the moment, I'll defer to Gary.
Getting it on the agenda?
No, I talking about it, I don't think is gonna, it's useful. It makes us feel better. One thing, as I hear this conversation, I'm thinking about this, sitting here on the East Coast of the US, thinking about how we sort of, we take the initiative and we push. And what I would like to encourage is a lot of really creative, independent thinking on the continent to think about how to attract and pull this investment, but importantly, on terms that are consistent with those of the interests of the countries and the people of Africa. And so the question is, how do we sort of come to that, right? Earlier, there was this discussion about capacity, and we can talk about, training programs and that sort of thing. But if you're going to try to attract capital, to me, capacity also means at the other end of those project spectrums, how you design projects, how do you sponsor projects, how do you create and mobilize resources for projects. One of the challenges that many countries in the continent have is that they don't have that level of capacity. They don't have people that have had 10, 15, 20 years experience doing that, whether whether that be
offices.
at a multilateral level or whether that be at the, in the private sector. And so where there have been cases where those kinds of structures or institutions have been put in place, they've been bringing back members of that diasporic community to come back and serve the local people, to serve the country in setting up some of those institutions. Many of these people are walking away from, Gary mentioned bankers. Many of these people have walked away from very high paying jobs at global investment banks in Paris and New York in order to come back and to create these institutions, establish that basis to develop capacity. And so one of the things that I think needs to happen is that governments within the region need to demonstrate their ability, first of all, to recognize those issues and then develop a baseline to create that capacity. I'll mention one example because I know we're running along on time. And some of you probably know this example far better than I do. And it's not a US example, okay? But I'm thinking of an institution that was set up in Senegal, FONSIS. FONSIS is a sovereign structure. It's a government-owned entity. It owns or holds much of the state's assets, right, and state-owned enterprises. But it's also responsible for certain development projects within the country. Now, again, all of these institutions have, are flawed in some fashion or another, partly because of the fact that they're still developing capacity. But one of the things that FONSIS was able to do under the leadership of a gentleman you all may know, who's I think the current sitting Minister of Commerce and the Economy in Senegal, Amadou Hott, who was formerly at the African Development Bank, but developed a framework to be able to attract foreign capital in scale. And the project that I find especially interesting, at least one, was one that was done to develop a solar utility in Senegal that was done with equity capital from Meridiam, which is a French infrastructure investor. One last thing, Meridiam's funds on average are between 15 and 25 years in duration. Meridiam is a long-term source of capital. Meridiam has teams on the continent, and they are focused very much on sustainable development, sustainable infrastructure. So, I think there are models here. I think there are models that can extend and develop that capacity. I really think they have to be done on the terms of the countries and the people of the continent. And because without that initiative, you're relying on the US to get its act together. You might be waiting a while.
I mean, one question which has come up from the audience, and I say to the audience, we're entering the last 10 minutes of this fascinating discussion. If you've got any questions you want to put to any of the panelists, just go to the chat or go to the Q&A. And on that, we've had one question, and I think you've touched on this, Patrick, already. When we're looking at training in Africa, how much do we need to consult with Africans on their needs? I mean, how much does this need to be a 50-50 partnership?
Well, I think inevitably that initiative has to come locally. Now, inevitably, right? So the idea of coming in from the outside and trying to explain to people what you think they need, to me is sort of looking at this from the wrong direction, which is again back to this point where I think the countries and the people in the region really do need to lead on these things. Now, do you help them to identify gaps? Yes, but in terms of closing those gaps, there are cultural and other local institutional features that I've come to learn very well in doing some work with Ghana that you cannot ignore. And so trying to impose solutions from the outside, to me, they're not in keeping not only with the spirit, but in the